The autumn rain had turned the roads of northern France into rivers of mud that sucked at boots and pulled at the wheels of supply trucks, struggling to keep pace with the Allied advance. Private James Neshoba walked at the front of the column, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds against the wet earth. Each step was calculated, each placement of his foot a conscious decision born from years of training that had nothing to do with the United States Army. Behind him, the men of 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 28th Infantry Division trudged forward in exhausted silence, their rifles slung over shoulders grown weary from weeks of continuous combat. It was late October 1944, and the Allied advance toward Germany had slowed to a grinding, bloody crawl. Every village held the possibility of resistance. Every field could conceal a minefield. Every tree line might hide a German machine gun nest waiting to tear through American flesh. Neshoba's eyes moved constantly across the landscape, reading the terrain the way his grandfather had taught him back on the Apache reservation in Arizona. The old man, whose name had been Running Deer, had taken young James into the Sonoran Desert when he was barely 6 years old and taught him to see what others missed. A bent blade of grass told a story. A displaced pebble revealed a path. The silence of birds warned of predators. The position of shadows indicated time and direction. These were not skills learned from books or instructors. They were knowledge passed down through generations, refined over centuries, earned through survival. The white soldiers behind him saw only trees and fields, mud and rain. They saw obstacles and distances, objectives and map coordinates. Neshoba saw a living landscape that spoke to him in a language older than nations, older than the war that had brought them all to this foreign soil. He saw stories written in broken branches that indicated recent passage, disturbed soil that suggested hasty digging, the flight patterns of birds that revealed human presence. He had learned these skills tracking deer and rabbits across the unforgiving desert, reading the sand and stone to find water and game. Now he tracked something far more dangerous, far more cunning. German soldiers who knew this terrain, who had prepared it, who waited in the shadows for Americans to make mistakes. Sergeant Robert Callahan moved up beside him, his Thompson submachine gun held loosely across his chest, his eyes scanning the tree line with the perpetual wariness of a man who had seen too many friends die from a moment's inattention. The sergeant was a hard man from the Irish neighborhoods of South Boston, weathered by 3 years of brutal combat across 2 continents. He had fought in the desert heat of North Africa, where the Africa Corps had taught the Americans hard lessons about mobile warfare. He had survived the invasion of Sicily, where every hill concealed German paratroopers and Italian defenders. He had waded ashore on Omaha Beach on June 6th, stepping over the bodies of men who had landed minutes before him, feeling bullets snap past his head as he ran across sand that ran red with American blood. He trusted maps and orders, procedures and protocols, the solid reliability of military doctrine. He did not trust instincts or feelings or anything that could not be verified with a compass and a ruler. "How much farther to the next village?" Callahan asked, his voice rough and gravelly from too many cigarettes smoked in too many foxholes, from too many nights shouting orders over the sound of artillery and machine gun fire. Neshoba pointed ahead where the forest began to thin, where the late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in pale golden shafts. 2 kilometers, maybe less. But the terrain changes soon, opens up into farmland. The trees will give way to fields. Behind them, Corporal Eddie Mancini laughed loudly at something Private Danny Sullivan had said, his voice carrying forward through the column with the brash confidence of someone who had not yet been truly tested by this war. Mancini was always laughing, always making jokes, always performing for an audience of tired men who appreciated any distraction from the cold and wet and constant fear. The Brooklyn native had grown up in a neighborhood where every ethnicity had its stereotype, where Italian kids fought Irish kids who fought Jewish kids, where everyone knew their place in the hierarchy of the streets. He had grown up watching cowboy movies at the local theater every Saturday afternoon, sitting in the cheap seats and cheering when the cavalry arrived to save the settlers from the Indians. In those movies, Indians were either noble savages who spoke in broken English and worshipped nature, or bloodthirsty villains who scalped innocent women and children. They were never just people, never complex or contradictory or fully human. Mancini treated Neshoba like a curiosity, something between a mascot and an oddity, a real-life Indian who could be teased and prodded and made to perform. "Hey, Chief," Mancini called out, using the nickname that made Neshoba's jaw clench every time he heard it. "You gonna do a rain dance for us, get this weather cleared up? Maybe summon some sunshine and dry ground?" Several men chuckled, the laughter nervous and forced, the kind of humor that soldiers use to push back against fear and exhaustion. They were cold and wet and far from home, and laughing at someone else made them feel slightly less miserable. Neshoba kept walking, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He had heard worse, much worse. In basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, drill sergeants had called him everything from Tonto to Geronimo to Sitting Bull, had asked him where his horse was, had made whooping sounds when he ran the obstacle course. The other recruits had expected him to perform savagery on command, to demonstrate some innate warrior spirit that existed only in their imaginations and in Hollywood movies. When he spoke quietly and kept to himself, when he followed orders precisely and performed every task with methodical competence, they seemed almost disappointed, as if he had somehow failed to live up to their expectations of what an Indian should be. Only Private Tommy Reeves, a farm boy from rural Oklahoma, treated him like a regular soldier, like just another man doing a difficult job in impossible circumstances. Reeves had grown up near Cherokee land and had gone to school with native kids, had played baseball with them and shared lunches and learned that they were just people with the same hopes and fears and dreams as everyone else. He knew they were not movie characters or mystical figures or simple stereotypes. They were individuals with families and histories and personalities as varied as any other group. "Leave him alone, Eddie," Reeves said now, his voice carrying a note of reproach. "He's doing his job. We should be grateful he's up there instead of one of us." "I'm just having fun," Mancini protested, his tone suggesting genuine confusion, that anyone might be offended. "Chief knows I'm kidding. Right, Chief? We're all buddies here." Neshoba said nothing. He had learned that responding only encouraged more comments, more jokes, more performance. Silence was simpler. Silence kept him focused on the work. Sergeant Callahan shot Mancini a warning look that promised unpleasant consequences if the comments continued, and the corporal fell silent, though his grin suggested he felt no real remorse. They reached the edge of the forest as the afternoon sun broke briefly through the heavy cloud cover, casting long shadows across the landscape. Ahead lay exactly what Neshoba had feared when he studied the map that morning. An open field, perhaps 300 meters across and 200 meters deep, with another dense tree line on the far side. The field was covered in tall grass, golden and brown, swaying gently in the breeze that carried the smell of rain and wet earth. A small stone farmhouse sat at the northern edge of the field, its windows dark and empty, its door hanging open on broken hinges. The building looked abandoned, but something about it bothered Neshoba. It was too intact. Most of the farmhouses they had passed in recent days had been damaged by artillery or looted by passing soldiers from both sides. This one looked almost pristine, as if someone had carefully preserved it. To the south, a low stone wall ran along the field's border, partially collapsed in places, covered with vines and moss. It looked ancient, probably built 100 years ago to mark property boundaries or contain livestock. Lieutenant William Hargrove came forward from his position in the middle of the column, studying his map with the intense concentration of someone who trusted paper more than observation. The young officer was on his first combat deployment, fresh from officer candidate school at Fort Benning, where he had graduated near the top of his class based on his ability to memorize doctrine and execute training exercises with precision. He carried himself with the rigid confidence of someone who had never seen what a German MG-42 machine gun could do to a human body, who had never watched a friend bleed out in the mud while calling for his mother, who had never felt the soul-crushing terror of being pinned down by mortar fire, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He believed in the Army's systems and procedures, in the wisdom of superior officers, in the power of proper planning and execution. "This field," Hargrove said, tapping his map with one finger, his voice carrying the certainty of someone reading from a textbook. "It's a straight shot to the village of Saint-Michel. We cross here. We save at least an hour of march time, maybe more. Captain Reynolds wants us in position before dark to establish a defensive perimeter. The rest of the company is depending on us to secure the approach." Neshoba studied the field carefully, his eyes moving across every detail, his mind processing information that most men would never notice. Something was wrong. He could feel it the way he had felt thunderstorms coming across the Arizona desert, a pressure in the air, a subtle wrongness that he could not quite name but knew with absolute certainty. It was the same feeling he had gotten as a boy when he walked into a canyon and sensed a mountain lion watching from the rocks above. The same instinct that had kept his ancestors alive for thousands of years in an unforgiving landscape. He walked slowly along the tree line, examining the ground, the grass, the sight lines from the farmhouse and stone wall, the angle of approach from the far tree line. The grass near the edge was crushed in places, but not by wind or rain. These were compression patterns, the kind made by boots, by men moving through and then carefully trying to obscure their passage. The marks were faint, almost invisible, but they were there. Boot prints, German boot prints based on the tread pattern, carefully obscured but still visible to eyes trained to read such signs. Someone had walked along this edge recently, probably within the last day or two, studying the field from the American approach, planning fields of fire and kill zones. The farmhouse windows were too dark, too perfect. When Neshoba looked at abandoned buildings, he expected to see signs of abandonment, broken glass, debris, damage from weather or combat, evidence that soldiers from both sides had sheltered there and left their marks. This farmhouse showed none of that. No broken glass sparkled in the window frames, no debris littered the doorway, no graffiti marked the walls. It looked staged, prepared, maintained for a purpose. The stone wall offered perfect cover for machine gun positions. It was exactly the right height, approximately 1 meter tall, just high enough for a gunner to rest his weapon and fire, while remaining protected from return fire. The gaps in the collapsed sections created natural firing ports with excellent overlapping fields of fire across the entire width of the field. And the birds. Neshoba realized with growing certainty that there were no birds singing in the trees across the field. The forest on the far side was silent in a way that natural forests never were. Birds fell silent when predators were near, when humans disturbed their territory, when something was wrong. That silence screamed danger to anyone who knew how to listen. He returned to where Lieutenant Hargrove stood with Sergeant Callahan, both men studying the map and discussing the route. "Sir, I strongly recommend we do not cross this field." Hargrove looked up from his map, his expression shifting from concentration to surprise to something like annoyance. "Why not, Private? It is not safe. The Germans have been here. I see clear signs of preparation. The farmhouse and the wall are positioned perfectly for an ambush. The far tree line is too quiet. No birds, no normal forest sounds. I believe enemy soldiers are waiting in concealed positions, and this field is a prepared killing zone." Corporal Mancini, who had moved forward to hear the conversation, snorted with derision. "He thinks? What, you got Indian magic now, Chief? You can sense the Germans with your mystical powers? Maybe you can smell them on the wind?" Several men laughed nervously. They were tired, cold, wet, and the idea of adding an extra hour or more of marching through the muddy forest did not appeal to anyone. The direct route looked so simple, so easy. Just walk across an empty field. What could be simpler? Lieutenant Hargrove frowned, his expression suggesting he was trying to be patient with a subordinate who was making his job more difficult. "Private Neshoba, I appreciate your caution, and I understand you have certain skills in observation. But we have our orders from Captain Reynolds. We are expected to maintain pace with the rest of the battalion. I do not see any Germans. I do not see any fortifications or obstacles. I see an empty field with clear approaches and good visibility. It's tactically sound. With respect, sir, the signs are there if you know how to read them. The grass has been walked on recently by soldiers trying to hide their passage. The farmhouse is too intact, too clean. It should show damage or looting, but it looks maintained. The stone wall provides perfect cover for machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire. And there are no birds singing in those trees across the field. Something has frightened them into silence, and that something is human presence." Sergeant Callahan studied the field with the careful attention of a man who had survived 3 years of combat by trusting his instincts as much as his training. He looked at the farmhouse, at the stone wall, at the far tree line. He did not see what Neshoba saw, but he respected the young Apache scout's abilities. Neshoba had been right before, had spotted ambushes and obstacles that others had missed. But Callahan also understood the chain of command, the importance of following orders, the pressure that Lieutenant Hargrove was under to perform and prove himself. "Lieutenant," Callahan said carefully, "maybe we should send a small scout team across first. Test the crossing. If Private Neshoba is wrong, we lose 5 minutes. If he's right, we save lives. Hargrove shook his head with visible impatience. We do not have time for excessive caution, Sergeant. Captain Reynolds was explicit. We are already behind schedule because of that blown bridge yesterday. We need to make up time. This field is the fastest route. He raised his voice so the entire platoon could hear. All right, men, listen up. We are crossing this field in 2 waves to maintain proper spacing. First squad leads with Lieutenant Hargrove. Second squad follows at 50-meter interval with Sergeant Callahan. Keep your intervals, stay alert, weapons ready, move with purpose. Let's go. Neshoba stepped directly in front of the lieutenant, a breach of protocol that made several soldiers gasp. Sir, I cannot cross that field. It is a killing zone. I am certain of this. Every instinct, every sign, everything I know tells me that field will kill us. The lieutenant's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Behind him, the entire platoon had gone quiet, watching the confrontation unfold. This was not how things were done. Privates did not refuse orders. Privates did not challenge officers in front of other men. The army ran on discipline and hierarchy, and Neshoba was threatening both. Private, are you refusing a direct order? Hargrove's voice was sharp, dangerous, the voice of an officer whose authority was being challenged and who would not tolerate it. I am telling you what I see, what I know. That field is a trap. We will die if we cross it. Mancini laughed outright now, his voice carrying across the assembled platoon. Oh, this is rich, this is beautiful. The Indians scared. What's wrong, Chief? Afraid of a little open ground? Maybe you should have stayed on the reservation where it's safe. Maybe the army isn't the place for someone who's afraid of empty fields. More laughter rippled through the platoon, though some of it sounded forced and uncomfortable. Even some of the men who liked Neshoba and respected his abilities seemed embarrassed by his refusal. In the army, you followed orders. You did not argue with officers based on feelings and intuitions and the behavior of birds. That was not how modern warfare worked. That was not how disciplined soldiers behaved. Sergeant Callahan put a heavy hand on Neshoba's shoulder, his grip firm but not hostile. Son, I know you are worried. I know you see things the rest of us don't. But we have our orders, and orders matter. Sometimes you just have to trust the brass and do your job. Neshoba looked into the sergeant's eyes, searching for understanding, for some acknowledgement that his concerns were valid. Sergeant, I trust what the land tells me. And right now, the land is screaming danger. Everything about this field is wrong. Lieutenant Hargrove had had enough of this insubordination, this challenge to his authority in front of his men. Private Neshoba, you will fall to the rear of the column immediately. You are relieved of point duty. Corporal Mancini, you take point position. First squad, form up on me at the tree line. Let us show our Apache friend how real soldiers handle an open field. Mancini strutted forward, his rifle held high, his face split by a wide grin. Sure thing, Lieutenant. Happy to show some leadership. Watch and learn, Chief. This is how white men fight a war. This is how civilized soldiers operate. The men of First Squad formed up at the tree line in a staggered line formation, the way they had been trained. Corporal Mancini on point, Private Sullivan to his left, Private Reeves to his right, and 6 others spread across a front of about 30 meters. Lieutenant Hargrove positioned himself in the center of the formation, his carbine held at the ready. Sergeant Callahan moved back to organize Second Squad, which would follow at a 50-meter interval to avoid bunching up and presenting a concentrated target. Neshoba backed away as ordered, moving to the rear of the column where the radio man and medics waited, but he did not take his eyes off the field. Every instinct screamed at him to stop this, to make them listen, to physically prevent them from walking into that killing zone. But he was just a private, just an Indian, just someone whose wisdom did not fit on a map or in a field manual. His knowledge came from a different source, a different tradition, and in this moment, that made it worthless in the eyes of the men who made decisions. First Squad, advance, Lieutenant Hargrove shouted, his voice cracking slightly with nervous excitement. The 9 men stepped out of the protective cover of the tree line and into the open field. They moved in a staggered line, weapons ready, eyes scanning the far tree line for any sign of movement. The tall grass swished around their legs, making soft rustling sounds. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and vegetation. The sky overhead was heavy with clouds that promised more rain. It looked peaceful, almost pastoral, like a scene from a painting of the French countryside. Corporal Mancini called back over his shoulder, his voice full of cocky confidence. "See, Chief? Nothing out here but grass and fresh air. No Germans, no ambush, no danger, just another empty field. Maybe you should—" The world exploded into chaos and death. The German machine guns opened fire simultaneously from 3 carefully prepared and camouflaged positions, 2 in the farmhouse windows where gunners had waited in darkness for hours, and 1 behind the stone wall where a team had dug in and covered their position with cut vegetation. The MG-42 machine guns fired at their standard rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, their distinctive sound like ripping canvas, like the sky itself tearing apart. The Germans called them Hitlersäge, Hitler's buzzsaw, and American soldiers had learned to fear that sound more than almost anything else. Tracer rounds cut through the afternoon air in brilliant lines of red and orange, creating a crossfire that covered every meter of the field with overlapping fire. Private Danny Sullivan went down first, hit simultaneously by rounds from 2 different guns. The bullets struck him in the chest and throat, tearing through flesh and bone and vital organs. He dropped without a sound, dead before his body hit the ground, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. Blood soaked into the golden grass around him. Corporal Mancini dove forward, his cocky grin replaced by a mask of terror, screaming into the grass. "Contact! Contact front! Machine guns! Get down!" A burst of machine gun fire stitched across his back and side, the impacts making his body jerk and twist. He went silent mid-scream, his face pressed into the mud, blood spreading across his uniform. "Get down! Hit the ground! Everyone down!" Sergeant Callahan roared from the tree line, his voice barely audible over the incredible volume of machine gun fire. Lieutenant Hargrove was on his belly in the grass, his face white with shock and disbelief. His carefully planned advance turned into a nightmare in seconds. He tried to crawl backward, tried to reach the safety of the tree line, but machine gun fire kicked up dirt and grass all around him. Tommy Reeves crawled desperately toward a small depression in the earth, a slight fold in the ground that offered maybe 6 inches of defilade. Bullets snapped over his head with sounds like angry wasps, so close he could feel the pressure waves. 2 more men from First Squad were hit in the first 10 seconds, their screams cutting through the chaos. Then the mortars started falling. The Germans had pre-registered the field, had measured distances and calculated angles, knew exactly where to drop their rounds for maximum effect. The first explosion threw dirt and grass and pieces of stone 20 feet into the air. The second landed directly on top of a soldier trying to crawl back to the tree line. The concussion and shrapnel turned him into red mist and scattered pieces. The third and fourth rounds landed in quick succession, creating a wall of explosions between the trapped men and safety. The men still in the forest scattered, diving behind trees, pressing themselves into the earth, trying to become smaller targets. Sergeant Callahan grabbed his radio handset, shouting coordinates for artillery support, calling for smoke, for suppression fire, for anything that might help the men dying in that field. But help was minutes away, and the men in the field were dying now, in this moment, because they had not listened. Neshoba watched from behind a thick oak tree, his heart breaking, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. He had known. He had seen the signs. He had warned them, and they had laughed. They had called him scared, had questioned his courage, had mocked his knowledge, and now they were dying, bleeding out in the mud, screaming for medics who could not reach them, crying for mothers who would never see them again. Tommy Reeves was still alive, pinned down in his shallow depression, machine gun fire raking back and forth over his position every few seconds. Every time he tried to lift his head, every time he attempted to move, bullets kicked up dirt around him. He was crying, calling for his mother, calling for God, calling for anyone to help him. His voice was high and thin with terror, the voice of a boy, not a soldier. Neshoba looked at the field, his mind working with the cold precision of someone who had been trained since childhood to survive impossible situations. He calculated angles and distances, studied the pattern of machine gun fire, noted the timing of mortar rounds. The machine guns were focused on the men already in the open, on the obvious targets. The Germans would not expect anyone to come from the tree line now, not after the devastating ambush. If he moved fast, stayed low, used the slight roll in the terrain that he had noticed earlier, the fold in the ground that was nearly invisible but provided a covered approach. "Neshoba, stay put," Sergeant Callahan shouted, seeing the look on the young scout's face. "That is a direct order. You cannot help them. You will just get yourself killed." But Neshoba was already moving. He dropped his rifle, knowing it would only slow him down and catch on vegetation. He kept only his knife, his canteen, and the 2 smoke grenades clipped to his belt. He sprinted from the tree line at an angle, not straight across but diagonal, using a small fold in the ground that he had spotted during his initial reconnaissance. The grass was just tall enough to hide him if he stayed low. If he moved with the ground instead of against it, he moved the way he had moved hunting rabbits as a boy in Arizona, fast and silent and low, reading the terrain, feeling where the earth would support him, where it would hide him, where it would betray him. The machine guns continued firing, but they were focused on their pre-planned sectors, on the men already trapped in the open. Neshoba covered 50 meters in seconds, his body remembering skills learned long before he ever put on an army uniform. Then 75 meters. He could hear the machine gun rounds snapping overhead, could feel the pressure waves, could smell the cordite and blood and churned earth. A mortar round exploded to his left, close enough that the blast wave lifted him partially off his feet and slammed him back down hard. His ears rang, his vision blurred, dirt and debris rained down on him, but he forced himself up and kept moving, kept low, kept focused on Tommy Reeves crying in his depression 50 meters ahead. He reached Tommy and dropped into the depression beside him, his arrival so sudden that the Oklahoma boy nearly screamed in terror before recognizing who it was. Tommy's eyes were wide with shock and fear and desperate hope. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. "James, I thought I was dead. I thought I was going to die here." "Not today, brother," Neshoba said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. He pulled Reeves close, checking him quickly for wounds. No blood, no obvious injuries, just terror. "When I say move, you run back the way I came. Stay low. Follow the fold in the ground. Do not run straight. Angle to the left. Do you understand me?" Reeves nodded, his teeth chattering despite the relatively warm day, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear. "I understand. But James, what about you? I will be right behind you. But first I give us cover." Neshoba pulled a smoke grenade from Reeves's belt, armed it, and threw it toward the farmhouse in a high arc. The grenade popped and began spewing thick white smoke that drifted across the field, obscuring sight lines. He pulled his own smoke grenade, armed it, and threw it in a different direction, toward the stone wall. Within seconds, smoke was billowing across the field, white and thick, reducing visibility to just a few meters. The machine gun fire continued but became less accurate, the gunners firing blindly into the smoke. "Now! Run! Go!" Reeves scrambled up and ran, his legs pumping desperately, his arms swinging, his rifle clutched in one hand. Machine gun fire followed him, the gunners tracking the sound of his movement through the smoke. Bullets snapped through the air around him so close he could hear them cutting through the smoke. But he kept running, kept low, following the path Neshoba had indicated, using the fold in the ground, angling left. His lungs burned, his legs felt like they were made of lead, but he ran harder than he had ever run in his life. Neshoba waited 3 seconds, giving Reeves distance, then followed. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the grass where he had been lying just moments before. He zigzagged as he ran, using every dip and rise in the terrain, moving with the instincts of a lifetime of training. Another mortar round exploded, this one close enough that the blast lifted him completely off his feet and slammed him down hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that blocked out all other sound. His vision blurred and darkened at the edges. Blood ran from his nose, but he forced himself up, forced his legs to move, forced his body to keep going even though every muscle screamed in protest. He dove over the edge of the tree line and rolled behind a fallen log, his chest heaving, his heart hammering. Reeves was there, gasping for breath, alive and whole. Sergeant Callahan grabbed Neshoba by the shoulder, his face a mixture of fury and awe, and something that might have been respect. "You crazy son of a bitch," Callahan breathed, his voice shaking. "You beautiful, crazy, insane son of a bitch. You just ran through a machine gun kill zone to save one man." "He is my brother," Neshoba said simply once he had enough breath to speak. "We wear the same uniform. That makes us family." The machine gun fire continued for another 5 minutes. the Germans pouring rounds into the smoke, into the field, into anything that moved. Then gradually, as the smoke began to clear and no more targets presented themselves, the firing ceased. The smoke drifted away on the breeze. The field was silent except for the moaning of wounded men, sounds that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. 4 soldiers were dead in the field. Sullivan, killed instantly in the first burst. 2 others cut down trying to retreat. 1 obliterated by a direct mortar hit. 3 more were badly wounded, including Corporal Mancini, who lay face down in the grass, bleeding from multiple wounds in his back and side, still alive, but barely. Lieutenant Hargrove had taken shrapnel in his leg and shoulder from a near-miss mortar round. He was conscious but in shock, his face gray, his carefully planned advance turned into a catastrophe. Medics worked frantically while Sergeant Callahan called in artillery strikes on the German positions. He gave precise coordinates for the farmhouse and stone wall, calling for high explosive and white phosphorus. Within 10 minutes, American 105mm howitzers were dropping shells on the German positions. The farmhouse disappeared in a series of explosions that sent stone and timber flying. The stone wall was obscured by smoke and fire. The German machine guns fell silent, their crews either dead or withdrawn. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene given what had just happened, the platoon finally crossed the field. They moved carefully, slowly, taking a route along the southern edge exactly where Neshoba had suggested hours earlier. They moved around the bodies of their friends, some men looking, some men deliberately not looking, all of them carrying the weight of what had happened. No more shots were fired. The Germans had withdrawn after the artillery barrage, falling back to new positions, leaving their killing zone behind. They reached the far tree line and immediately set up defensive positions, digging foxholes, establishing fields of fire, preparing for counterattack. Medics loaded the wounded onto stretchers improvised from shelter halves and tree branches. Corporal Mancini was conscious but pale, his cocky swagger replaced by pain and shock and the terrible knowledge of his own mortality. As they carried him past Neshoba, he reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the Apache scout's arm with surprising strength. "Chief, James." His voice was weak, bubbling with blood in his lungs. "I am sorry. I should have listened. I should have believed you. I was a fool, a stupid fool. All those things I said, all those jokes. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Neshoba knelt beside the stretcher, taking Mancini's hand in his own. "Eddie, rest now. Save your strength. The medics will take care of you. You will heal. You will go home to Brooklyn and see your family again. I was wrong about you. Wrong about everything. You are the bravest man I ever met. You saved Tommy. You could have stayed safe, but you ran into hell to save him." Tears ran down Mancini's face, cutting tracks through the dirt and blood. "Tell my mother. Tell her I learned something. Tell her I learned to listen. I will tell her. I promise." They carried Mancini away and Neshoba stood slowly, his body aching from the blast concussion, his ears still ringing, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Lieutenant Hargrove was sitting against a tree, his leg bandaged, his shoulder wrapped, his face the color of old paper. He looked up as Neshoba approached, and in his eyes was something the Apache scout had never seen there before: humility. "Private Neshoba," the lieutenant said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you my life. We all do. You were right, about everything, and I was wrong. I let pride and schedule override common sense and experience. I ignored wisdom because it did not fit my training, because it did not come from the sources I had been taught to trust. Good men died because I would not listen. That blood is on my hands. I will carry that for the rest of my life." Neshoba sat down beside the lieutenant, suddenly too tired to stand. "Sir, the Army teaches officers to trust maps and orders, to follow doctrine and procedure. Those things have value. They win wars. But my people teach different lessons. We teach that the land speaks, that nature warns, that wisdom comes from observation and experience passed down through generations. Both approaches have value. Both can save lives. The trick is knowing when to use which, knowing when to trust the map, and when to trust the ground beneath your feet. How do I learn that? How do I know? You listen. To everyone. To the private who grew up hunting in the woods. To the sergeant who has survived 3 years of combat. To the scout who reads the land. You gather all the wisdom available to you, and then you decide. You were taught that officers make decisions alone, that leadership means confidence and certainty. But the best leaders I have known, the elders of my people, they listened to everyone before deciding. They gathered wisdom like water in a desert. They knew that no one person has all the answers. Lieutenant Hargrove nodded slowly, painfully. I will remember that. If I survive this war, if I ever lead men again, I will remember. Sergeant Callahan joined them, his face grim and exhausted. Captain Reynolds is not happy. We are 3 hours behind schedule. We took heavy casualties, and we failed to secure the objective on time. But we are alive, most of us. He looked at Neshoba with an expression that combined respect, gratitude, and something like awe. That run you made to get Reeves, that was the bravest damn thing I have seen in 3 years of combat, and I have seen men do incredible things. I am putting you in for a Bronze Star with V device. You earned it 100 times over. Neshoba shook his head. Sergeant, I do not need a medal. Medals do not bring back Sullivan or the others. I just need people to listen when the land speaks. I need people to understand that wisdom comes from many sources, not just from books and training. If we learn that lesson, if even one life is saved because someone listened to a warning they might have ignored, then this terrible day will have some meaning. That night, the platoon dug foxholes and set up a perimeter in the forest beyond the field. Men who had laughed at Neshoba that morning now sought him out, asking him to check their positions, to tell them if the ground felt safe, to advise them on fields of fire and natural approaches. He moved among them quietly, offering advice, adjusting positions, pointing out natural avenues of approach that German patrols might use, suggesting improvements to their defenses. He did not lecture or scold or remind them that they had not listened. He simply helped them survive, because that was his job, because they were his brothers, because the uniform they all wore mattered more than pride or past mistakes. Tommy Reeves sat with him during the first watch, sharing a canteen of cold coffee that tasted like metal and bitterness. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the distant rumble of artillery, the closer sounds of men digging and talking in low voices. Thank you for coming back for me, Reeves finally said. You did not have to do that. You could have stayed safe. No one would have blamed you. But you ran through hell to save me. Tommy, you are my brother. We wear the same uniform. When I put on this uniform, I made a promise to the men beside me. That promise matters more than safety, more than fear, more than anything else. You would have done the same for me. I hope so. I hope I am that brave when the time comes. You are already brave. You stood up for me when others mocked me. You treated me like a person when others treated me like a curiosity. That takes courage too. Different courage, but just as important. They sat in silence again, and then Reeves asked the question that had been on his mind. What was it like? Growing up on the reservation? Growing up Apache? Neshoba considered the question carefully. It was beautiful and hard. The land is beautiful, the desert and mountains. But the reservation is also a prison in some ways. My people were put there by the government after we were defeated in war, told where we could live, what we could do, how we could practice our traditions. Many of our ceremonies were illegal for years. Our children were taken to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking our language, where they were taught to be ashamed of who they were. My grandfather was sent to one of those schools as a boy. They cut his hair, gave him a Christian name, beat him when he spoke Apache, but he never forgot who he was. He kept the old knowledge alive, and he passed it to me. That is terrible. I did not know. Most people do not know. They see Indians in movies and think they know us. But movies show fantasies, not reality. We are not noble savages or bloodthirsty warriors. We are people with a long history and deep traditions. People who have survived terrible things and kept our culture alive despite everything. When I joined the army, some people on the reservation said I was betraying my people, fighting for the government that destroyed us. But I see it differently. I am proving that we belong, that we are Americans too, that we can serve and sacrifice and contribute. Maybe if enough of us serve with honor, people will see us differently. Maybe they will listen when we speak. Maybe they will respect the wisdom we carry. After today, I think people will listen to you. Maybe, or maybe they will forget as soon as the fear fades. People have short memories for lessons learned in blood, but I will keep trying. What else can I do? The night deepened around them. Stars appeared between the clouds, cold and distant. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and Neshoba smiled. The birds were singing again. That was always a good sign. That meant the forest was at peace, at least for now. That meant they might survive another night. Over the following weeks and months, 2nd Platoon continued its grinding advance toward Germany. The autumn rains turned to winter snow. They fought through villages that resisted and villages that surrendered. They crossed rivers on temporary bridges built by combat engineers. They cleared forests of German defenders who fought from prepared positions. They advanced through the Vosges Mountains where every ridge was defended, where every valley was a potential killing zone. And at the front of every patrol, every advance, every movement into unknown territory, walked Private James Neshoba, reading the land, watching for signs, keeping his brothers alive. The men stopped calling him chief. They called him by his name, by his rank, or sometimes simply Scout with a capital S, a title of respect. When he said a position looked wrong, they listened without question. When he recommended a different route, they took it without argument. When he warned of danger, they prepared for it. He saved them from 2 more ambushes, spotting the signs of German preparation before they walked into killing zones. He warned them away from a stone bridge that looked solid, but that he somehow knew was rigged with explosives. Engineers confirmed it later, finding 500 pounds of demolition charges wired to blow. He led them through a minefield using nothing but his eyes and instincts, walking a path that somehow avoided every buried explosive. His gift for reading disturbed earth-saving lives with every step. Sergeant Callahan became something more than a superior officer. He became a friend, or as close to a friend as the Army allowed between ranks. The Boston native had grown up in a world of concrete and brick, of crowded streets and packed neighborhoods, but he learned to see what Neshoba saw. He learned the language of broken twigs and disturbed earth, the meaning of silence, the stories written in mud and snow. He learned to trust his instincts as much as his maps, to value wisdom regardless of its source, to listen before deciding. Lieutenant Hargrove recovered from his wounds and returned to the platoon in December, just as the German army launched its desperate offensive in the Ardennes that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. He was different now, quieter, more thoughtful, more willing to listen. He deferred to Neshoba on matters of terrain and tactics without hesitation or embarrassment. The cocky young officer who had trusted only his training and his maps had learned the hardest lesson of war, that book knowledge is not enough, that real wisdom comes from experience and observation, that the best leaders gather advice from all sources before making decisions. Corporal Eddie Mancini survived his wounds, but was sent home to Brooklyn, his combat days over. Before he left, he sought out Neshoba and shook his hand with genuine warmth and gratitude. "I was a jackass," he said simply, his eyes honest and clear. "I grew up thinking Indians were movie characters, not real people. I thought I knew what you were because I had seen some cowboy movies. I am sorry for that. You are the best soldier I ever served with, and I will spend the rest of my life telling people about you." Neshoba accepted the apology with a nod and a slight smile. "Eddie, go home. Be with your family. Tell them stories about the war, but tell them true stories, not movie stories. Tell them about all kinds of soldiers. Tell them that bravery and wisdom come in many forms, from many backgrounds. Tell them that we are stronger together than apart." "I will," Mancini promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear I will. And if I ever hear anyone making jokes about Indians, I will set them straight. I will tell them about the Apache scout who saved my life." In January 1945, 2nd Platoon crossed into Germany itself, advancing through the Siegfried Line, the massive defensive system that the Germans had built along their western border. The war was entering its final months, though no one knew that yet. They fought through the frozen hell of the Hurtgen forest, where trees exploded from artillery fire and sent wooden shrapnel flying like spears. They cleared bunkers and pillboxes, advancing meter by bloody meter. They fought through villages that resisted fanatically, and villages that surrendered without firing a shot. And always, Neshoba walked at the front, reading the land, listening to the silence, watching for the signs that others missed. He thought often of his grandfather, of running deer who had taught him to track deer in the Arizona desert so many years ago. The old man had said that all land speaks if you know how to listen. that the earth has a language older than words, older than nations, older than wars. It did not matter if it was desert or forest, America or Europe, peace or war. The earth spoke the same language everywhere, and those who learned to listen could hear its warnings and its wisdom. On a cold February morning with snow falling softly through bare trees, the platoon was advancing through a dense forest when Neshoba suddenly held up his fist, the signal to halt. The men froze immediately, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. They had learned to trust that signal absolutely, to react without question or hesitation. Neshoba knelt in the snow, studying the ground with intense concentration. Sergeant Callahan moved up beside him silently, waiting for the scout to speak. "What is it?" he finally whispered. "Tracks. German patrol, 6 men, maybe 7. They passed through here less than an hour ago. The snow has barely begun to cover their prints." He pointed to a cluster of pine trees about 50 meters ahead, where the forest grew thicker. "They are watching us from there, waiting to see which way we go, then they will radio our position and movement to their artillery." Callahan nodded and signaled for the platoon to take cover. He called up a machine gun team and a bazooka team, positioning them carefully based on Neshoba's assessment. Within minutes, they had flanked the German position, approaching from 2 directions while a third team provided suppression fire. The brief firefight ended with 4 Germans dead and 3 captured, cold and hungry soldiers who seemed almost relieved that their war was over. Not a single American was wounded. That night, as they made camp in an abandoned farmhouse, Tommy Reeves asked Neshoba a question that had been on his mind for months. "Do you ever think about after the war? What you will do when this is all over?" Neshoba stared into the fire they had built in the farmhouse fireplace, watching the flames dance and flicker. "I will go home to Arizona, back to the reservation. I will see my family, my grandfather if he is still alive. I will walk in the desert again, feel the sun on my face, hear the wind in the canyons. I will remember what it feels like to be at peace. Will you stay there? I do not know. The reservation is my home, the place where my people live, where our traditions survive. But it is also a prison in some ways, a place we were forced to accept after we were defeated. I fought for America. I bled for America. I proved my loyalty and my courage. But I wonder if America will ever see me as truly American, or if I will always be the Indian, the other, the outsider. I wonder if the lessons we learned here, the respect I earned, will survive when we go home, or if people will go back to seeing what they expect to see, believing what movies taught them to believe." Reeves did not have an answer for that. Neither did Sergeant Callahan, who was listening nearby, his face troubled. It was a question that hung in the air, unanswered and maybe unanswerable. They all knew that the world they would return to was not the world they had left. They had changed. But had the world changed? Would the men who had learned to respect Neshoba's wisdom in combat remember those lessons in peace? Or would old prejudices reassert themselves once the immediate danger passed? "But I know this," Neshoba continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I know that I did my duty. I saved lives. I honored my ancestors and my people. I proved that the old ways have value, that traditional knowledge can save lives even in modern war. Whatever comes after, I will face it the same way I faced that field in France, by trusting what I know, by listening to the land, by staying true to who I am. I am Apache. I am American. I am a soldier. Those things do not contradict each other. They complete each other, and no one can take that away from me." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. 2nd Platoon was in southern Germany when the news came through. Men cheered and cried and fired their weapons into the air in celebration. They had survived. Against all odds, through all the blood and horror and death, they had survived. They would go home. They would see their families again. They would live. Private James Neshoba stood apart from the celebration, looking east toward the mountains, thinking of all the men who had not survived, the ones who lay in fields and forests across France and Germany and would never go home. He thought of Private Sullivan, who had died in the first seconds of that ambush in October, who had never had a chance to hit the ground or take cover or fight back. He thought of the others, the faces and names that would stay with him forever, the brothers who had fallen and who he had failed to save. Sergeant Callahan found him there, standing alone in the fading light. "You all right, James?" It was not the first time the sergeant had used his first name, but it still meant something, still carried weight. Neshoba smiled slightly. "Yes, Bob. I am all right. I am thinking about going home, about what comes next. You earned it. You earned it 100 times over. You saved more lives than I can count. You taught us all how to see, how to listen, how to survive. Callahan pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes and offered one. Neshoba declined, as always. The sergeant lit his own and exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting away on the evening breeze. I have been thinking about what you said, about the land speaking, about listening. I think maybe that is not just about tracking Germans. I think maybe that is about life, about paying attention to what is around you, to what people are really saying, to what the world is trying to tell you. I think maybe you taught me how to live, not just how to survive. My grandfather would say you are becoming wise. Callahan laughed, a sound that carried both joy and sorrow. Nah, I am just becoming old. But I learned a lot from you, James. You taught me to see things I never would have seen otherwise. You saved my life more times than I can count. And you changed how I see the world, how I see people who are different from me. I will not forget that. And I will not forget you. When I get home to Boston, when people ask me about the war, I will tell them about you. I will tell them about the Apache scout who saved us all. They stood together in silence watching the sun set over the German mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Two men from different worlds, brought together by war, bound by respect and blood and shared survival. The war was over, but the lessons would last a lifetime. In the years that followed, James Neshoba would return to Arizona, to the reservation where he had grown up, to the desert and mountains that had shaped him. He would walk again in the places of his childhood, would reconnect with his family and his people, would participate in the ceremonies and traditions that had been passed down through generations. But he would also carry the war with him, the memories of frozen forests and muddy fields, of friends lost and enemies killed, of a platoon that learned to listen. He would tell stories to his children and grandchildren, stories about tracking through snow and reading signs in grass, about the day he refused to cross a field and saved lives by trusting what the land told him, about the respect he earned and the lessons he taught. He would tell them that being Apache and being American were not contradictions, that their heritage was not something to hide or be ashamed of, but something to honor and carry forward with pride. He would tell them that wisdom comes from many sources, that the old ways have value, that paying attention and listening carefully can save lives and change the world. And sometimes, late at night, he would think about that autumn afternoon in France, about the laughter of men who thought they knew better, about the terrible silence after the machine guns stopped firing, about the screams of the wounded and the dying. He would think about Corporal Mancini apologizing from a stretcher, about Lieutenant Hargrove learning humility, about Sergeant Callahan learning to see. He would think about Tommy Reeves crying in a depression in the earth, about the decision to run back into that killing zone, about the smoke and bullets and explosions. He would think about how wisdom can come from unexpected places, how knowledge passed down through generations of hunters and trackers could save lives in a modern war, how the land speaks the same language everywhere if you know how to listen. And he would remember the faces of the men he served with, the brothers who learned to trust him, who learned to see past the stereotypes and the movie images to the real person underneath. He would remember them with pride and sorrow, with love and loss, with the complex mixture of emotions that all veterans carry. The field in France still exists today, though it looks different now than it did in 1944. The grass still grows tall and golden in autumn. The farmhouse has been rebuilt, the stone wall repaired. Tourists sometimes visit, reading plaques about the battle that happened there, about the American platoon that walked into an ambush, about the men who died and the lessons learned. But few of them know the full story. Few know about the Apache scout who tried to warn them, who refused to cross because he could read the land in ways the others could not. Few know about the laughter that turned to screams, about the lesson learned too late, about the young man who ran back into the killing zone to save a friend. That story lives on in different ways, passed down through families, told and retold, changing slightly with each generation but keeping its essential truth. That wisdom comes from many sources, that prejudice can kill, that listening to voices different from your own might just save your life. It is a story about respect and humility, about the value of traditional knowledge in a modern world, about the courage to stand up for what you know is right, even when everyone around you is laughing. Private James Neshoba earned his Bronze Star with V device for valor that day. The citation mentioned his courage in rescuing a wounded comrade under fire, his disregard for personal safety, his exemplary devotion to duty. But he also earned something more valuable and more lasting: the respect of his brothers in arms, the knowledge that he had honored his people and his heritage, the certainty that he had made a difference in a world that often seemed determined to ignore or dismiss people like him. The platoon that laughed when the Apache scout refused to cross the field learned a lesson written in blood and mud and fire. They learned that the old ways have value, that traditional knowledge is not superstition or primitive belief, that a young man from an Arizona reservation could see things that maps and manuals could not show. They learned to listen, to respect, to value wisdom regardless of its source. And in learning those lessons, they survived. They went home. They lived to tell the story. In the end, that is all any soldier can hope for: to survive, to serve with honor, to protect the brothers beside them, to make some small difference in a vast and terrible conflict. James Neshoba did all of that and more. He carried the wisdom of his ancestors into a modern war and proved that some truths are timeless, that some skills transcend technology, that the land speaks to those who know how to listen. That is his legacy. That is his story. And it is a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth honoring. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more stories of courage, wisdom, and sacrifice from World War II, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for listening.